Well, good to have all of you here today. It's so wonderful to be here for the EPS Alumni Dissertation Showcase. This is actually the first of the departments, and so it's a very exciting day. I'm so glad that you're all able to join us as we celebrate and just sort of reflect on what each of these scholars have to offer for us today. Again, as Michael said, my name is Matthew. I'm a PhD student, a joint PhD student here in EPS in history. I'm studying John Muir, so I hope one day to be on the other side, showcasing something of my work. But in the meantime, I'm just very happy to celebrate and welcome you all. So today, what we'll be doing, just to kind of give a little heads up, an overview, we will introduce each of the speakers and they will present. They'll have 3 minutes to present each of their presentations. We'll go in alphabetical order. And then at the end of after everyone is presented, we're going to have a time for Q&A. So what I would encourage you to do as you are listening carefully, whatever might be piquing your interest, just write down some questions for our speakers. To kind of start us off there at the end, I'll have a question formed for us just to begin to kind of get the juices flowing, as you might say. But we're going to have an open Q&A time after everyone has presented. And as you'll notice here on today's screen, our speakers are listed in alphabetical order. They'll be presenting in alphabetical order. And so I'm just going to introduce them. You'll also notice that their email addresses are provided for you. And I'm sure they'd be very, very happy if you had some more nitty-gritty questions or personal kind of contact you want to make with them. They'd be very happy to receive correspondence from you. So without further ado, we'll enter in to our presentations. We'll have first presenter Lena Batt. Lena is Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Kansas. Second, we'll have Abby Beneke. Abby is EPS Faculty Associate and Postdoctoral Fellow in the School of Human Ecology here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Caitlin Brecklin, third, Postdoctoral Research Fellow, Initiative for Rural Education, Equity, and Economic Development at the University of North Dakota. Keith McNamara, Management and Program Analyst for the U.S. Department of Education. Rosie Miesner is Research Associate, Educational Policy Initiative at Carolina. And finally, Pheng, Assistant Professor at Penn Graduate School of Education. So welcome to you all. Thank you for being here.
The first speaker today is Dr. Lena Batt. Her dissertation talk title is How Do School Leaders Conceptualize, Garner, and Allocate Resources? A Qualitative Examination.
Thank you, Michael. Go ahead and start. So my research question that framed my research was, how do school leaders conceptualize, garner, and allocate resources? I go beyond the simple definition of resources, one that you can buy in a budget, to more abstract resources such as time, schedules, and pedagogy. For my dissertation focused on school-level resource decisions, I completed 3 different studies. The first, quantitative study, examined budget choices in New York City public schools, where there is greater principal-level fiscal autonomy than in most districts. My other 2 qualitative studies were based on 3 elementary schools in 2 typical mid-sized Midwestern districts, one that was an affluent suburb, while the other was a city about an hour away that was struggling economically. I used interviews and documents to understand how principals prioritized, used, allocated, and garnered resources, and thought about why these differences mattered in their decision-making. So I'm going to focus on the findings from the 2 qualitative studies and exemplify them using a quote from one of the principals. To set the context, the district is situated in a fiscally constrained community and decided to implement a new math curriculum in the elementary schools, which provided many manipulatives to help teach it. The principal I will highlight was from a school that was one of the 2 schools out of 12 that did not receive Title I funding. So their building budget was very small, even though 41% of their students qualified for free or reduced lunch. They felt a greater sense of scarcity around resources compared to the school that received Title I funding in the more affluent district in my study. So here's the quote that's on my slide. "We did get all the manipulatives because we have this brand new math curriculum we're adopting. And so I needed Unifix cubes. And I thought, you know what? My girlfriend's pretty resourceful. So I reached out to her. I know you're on whatever the Facebook things are where they sell things. I know now it's called Marketplace. Can you keep an eye on that? We need Unifix cubes because we have those snapping cubes, but they're so hard to manipulate and you don't get an accurate measurement. Well, so she went on there and posted it on Facebook, and a teacher I taught with 6 years ago messages and said, hey, you know what? I'm not teaching now. I bought a bunch of those myself. I'll just donate them to your school. And I mean, it was like people were coming out in droves and donating. The principal, a former classroom teacher, prioritized instruction in all of her resource decisions, even when her peers did not. As a result, as principal, she decided to co-teach the new curriculum with her teachers so that she knew the curriculum and how it was being implemented. This was in the midst of navigating staff absences in the pandemic. As she co-taught, she realized that the manipulatives provided with the curriculum could not be used easily by the younger students and was affecting their learning. She only knew this through the co-teaching experience. As a result, she used her connections and time to find new manipulatives, the Unifix cubes, even though she could not buy them with a limited building budget. She worked for several months and relied on many relationships she had cultivated for donations because she knew this was one of the best options for her students. This example exemplifies my main qualitative findings. First, while often assumed not to be the case by researchers, principals have agency around resource use and will often change how things are done, ultimately impacting the impact of any resource on students. Second, principals use their previous experience in educational philosophy to determine which resources they will prioritize in their school, such as instruction, compared to other ideas like equity or relationships. Third, principals in fiscally constrained districts, especially when they do not have Title I funding, since they are seen as more affluent schools, spend much more of their time fundraising and need to cultivate relationships to actually garner necessary resources, adding to inequity. And those were the main findings.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, Dr. Batt.
The next speaker is Dr. Abby Beneke. Her dissertation talk title is The Politics and Practice of School Discipline Reform.
Thanks, Michael. So with growing awareness of what has been called the school to prison pipeline, schools across the country have adopted alternatives to zero tolerance school discipline, ranging from social emotional learning to positive behavioral interventions and supports to restorative justice. And I wanted to know how these approaches with quite different roots had been proposed as a solution to zero tolerance discipline, with attention to the sociocultural and political economic forces that have shaped the landscape of school discipline reform. I also wanted to know how teachers and other school-based educators made sense of the multiple, sometimes conflicting pressures they were under in practice, and beyond their sense making, what that actually looked like in practice. So paying attention to their enactment. I used a comparative case study design developed by Leslie Bartlett and Francis Fabris to trace school discipline reform across 3 schools and using ethnographic methods. I used 3 complementary perspectives for my theoretical framework: policy as practice, racial capitalism, and care theory. And my findings demonstrate that educators struggled to make discipline reform coherent amidst administrative turnover and conflicting reform directives. And my analysis shows that teachers generally tried to integrate reform mandates aimed at addressing racially disproportionate discipline, but in doing so, they enacted what I call neoliberal care, which is a concept I advance in the dissertation to describe how the state and the market have reinforced the contradictory positions of white women teachers. And this strategy privileges white and non-disabled students while harming students of color and students with disabilities. I also highlight in the dissertation that neoliberal care isn't inevitable. And so I suggest several openings for more just and caring practice. For example, teachers generally rejected formal exclusion and the presence of school police, suggesting that they don't find them to be effective. And in many cases, teachers didn't know what to do and expressed not having alternatives. So I think while it's important to name teachers' racism and ableism that was evident in the data, teachers also didn't know, the fact that teachers didn't know what to do also offers a potential opening for more just and caring action. Moving forward with this work, I'm planning to continue analyzing student focus group data that I collected during my dissertation to highlight their perceptions of school discipline reform and their desires. And I'm hoping to turn this project into a book and plan to submit a book proposal this spring.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Beneke.
The next speaker is Dr. Caitlin Brecklin. Her dissertation talk title is District at the Edge, Policy, Community, Place, and Belonging in a School Closure Debate.
All right, so I'm taking a slightly different path in that I'm just going to talk about one part of my dissertation, which examined a small rural school district in serious fiscal crisis. So the school board of the Marion-Chester Area School District felt that they didn't have enough money to run the schools. And so what could they do? Market logic says that if a school is struggling, they'll be incentivized to either improve their student offerings and attract more students, or to cut their costs. But in Marion-Chester, neither of those was really an option. The district was small and rural, but was surrounded by larger, better resourced districts, so they weren't competing on an even playing field to start with. Since the state enacted unlimited interdistrict open enrollment, Marion-Chester lost 37% of their potential enrollment to those larger, better resource districts. So growing the student base had already failed. Could they cut costs? According to the school board, also no. After years of cutting costs wherever they could, they thought that to cut any more would lead more students to leave, which would necessitate more cuts, on in a downward spiral. So in this case, market-based reform policies like open enrollment set the district up for failure. So what about raising taxes? Wisconsin defines a revenue limit that historically a low one that governs how much money districts can raise without going to referendum. Most communities pass most referendums. Marion-Chester, on the other hand, had gone to referendums 17 times since 1990 and only passed 2. Marion-Chester found itself in a situation where they depended on their community for additional funds, but the community declined to grant them. So again, the revenue limit policy foreclosed an avenue that could have helped the district. If you can't raise tax rates, maybe then schools could take a more roundabout approach and work to grow their local tax base. A significant part of the district's catchment area, however, was state forest land, which is designated for conservation and therefore can't be used for economic development. Another significant portion of the district was farmland. Wisconsin land use and tax policies emphasize protecting farmland, so they limit development and they also limit taxes in different ways. So again, policy structures, in this case, ones that didn't even seem to have anything to do with schools, foreclosed even this more like roundabout route response that the district could have considered. So because of all this, the only option the school board felt was left was to vote to dissolve the district entirely. All of which leads to the point I want to make. Policies at the state and local level functioned to lead the school district into an untenable situation, effectively trapping the school board into ordering dissolution. Thank you all. Hopefully you didn't hear my dog growling at me.
We did not. Thank you so much, Dr. Brecklin. That was amazing.
The next speaker is Dr. Keith McNamara. His dissertation talk title is Testing Bias in Psychology, Law, and Public Policy, 1920 to 1980.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And thanks everyone for participating in the event. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Leslie, as well. So I want to start with a basic question. Some of you may have an opinion. Are standardized tests culturally biased? The answer to this question depends on who you ask. For many, the answer is yes. And they can point to a long history of abuses to back this up. From debates about intelligence testing during and after World War I to more recent court cases in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the idea that psychological tests are biased against certain groups has long been an assumption among many Americans. But if you ask specialists in psychometrics, the answer is often a qualified no. They might say that these tests have been thoroughly vetted to reduce or eliminate cultural bias, and that the question of whether a test is biased is strictly a technical psychometric one. Well, what accounts for these contradictory views? If claims about cultural bias aren't new, what explains the continued belief among many psychologists that ability tests continue to have valid application in measuring learning potential? How has the scientific legitimacy of these instruments survived despite repeated criticisms over the last century or more? To answer this, I searched through a wide range of archival and primary sources from the turn of the 20th century to the 1960s and the 1970s. Two main themes emerged from this research that I'll mention. First, testing bias was a perennial concern among psychologists from the beginnings of mental testing in the United States. The idea that tests might be invalid measures for certain socioeconomic, racial, linguistic, and cultural groups was a persistent threat to their legitimacy as objective scientific instruments. Second, how that legitimacy was threatened and the efforts that psychologists and others made to responding to claims of testing bias varied as the nature of these attacks shifted throughout the 20th century. In some cases, psychologists tried to improve the tests to make them more reliable or less prone to environmental influences. But what was constant was the belief that a purely objective assessment of native ability was possible, so long as cultural interferences could be effectively neutralized. By the mid-1970s, following decades of attacks by various critics, civil rights activists, and litigants prepared to bring their grievances to Congress and the courts, psychologists carved out a narrower technical definition of test bias to protect the scientific legitimacy of the tests and their own professional credibility. Now, why does this matter? Since the 1930s, tests have been increasingly important to business, government, and education for purposes of diagnosis, selection, hiring, admission, promotion, and other important, often life-altering decisions. Thus, the stakes about whether the tests used are biased have been and remain high. And the idea that tests should be impartial, non-discriminatory, and maybe even equitable has been and continues to be central to their legitimacy. Thus, the fact that these core assumptions have been vigorously contested in a wide range of historical contexts speaks to the importance of carefully examining those contexts and how the nature of those debates have changed or stayed the same over the last century or more.
Thank you so much, Dr. McNamara.
The next speaker is Dr. Rosie Miesner. Her dissertation talk title is Compliance Amid Complexity: How People and Policies Shape Special Education in Practice.
Hi, thank you for having me. And so I looked at how federal, state, and local policies shape the daily work of special education teachers. I was a special education teacher. It was really hard. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more about why it was so hard all the time. And so I designed this rad study, and then COVID happened. So I had to switch up everything and do a lot of my work remotely. So that I'm just saying that because it might happen to you and it's going to be okay. You will finish. So in terms of answering this question, I drew on policy as in practice framework to conduct a comparative case study of special education policy enactment. And I grounded it in 2 elementary schools and centered on a special education teacher at each school, and then further examined the transmission and translation of policy across district and state and federal contexts. So part of this was about 26 or 27 interviews with folks at the school, district, and state level. And then I conducted about 140 hours of remote observations of special education instruction, which felt quite hard. So this slide here focuses a bit on my first findings chapter. And so first I took a look at this policy of a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, as you see here in this slide. And a free and appropriate public education is a component of the Individuals with Disabilities Act, which addresses the quality and quantity of instruction for students with disabilities. So it includes specially designed instruction, so academic or social instruction, related services like speech or occupational therapy, but it also includes the general education instruction provided by grade level teachers. And during COVID, policy actors at the federal and state levels still maintained a really broad definition of FAPE. So it included student access to the general ed curriculum and also participation with general ed peers. But then when we got to the district and local level, this definition got really narrowed and focused mostly on specially designed instruction. So school context got involved here, and they further shaped how special education teachers could provide this instruction. During COVID, classrooms had to schedule certain hours that students were attending class virtually. And those scheduling practices really impacted the time that special ed teachers had available to serve students with disability. So sometimes they would pull students from their general ed instruction to make sure that they could deliver specially designed instruction. Another aspect of school context during this time was internet access and quality that wasn't consistent across students or even teachers, and also variable student attendance, which was sometimes exacerbated by irregular closings of schools, really limited instruction. So in response, special ed teachers tightened the control over instructional times, as I mentioned, and sometimes provided specially designed instruction during general education blocks. They also shifted materials, and it was interesting because special education teachers did this in different settings. So we saw some people sending home physical materials for students to work on and then take pictures of or send back to school, whereas other teachers really focused on apps on the internet. And this came down to just really personal comfort with these different pieces and also their capacity to explore these different options. And then finally, teachers assigned the provision of aspects of instruction to paraprofessionals, who were undoubtedly crucial staff members during this time, but also may not have had the same experience to deliver specially designed instruction to students with disabilities. So it really, when you look at these factors combined, they yielded this fragmented and limited enactment of FAPE at the ground level, but also kind of by virtue of necessity because of the resources available and the contextual factors that were at play during this point. I think I'm over time, so I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miesner. That was amazing.
The next speaker is Dr. Linda Pheng. Her dissertation talk title is Disrupting Displacement, Taking Root in a Southeast Asian Community-Based Educational Space for Southeast Asian Refugee Youth.
Thank you, Michael. So my dissertation was an ethnographic study, and I center my talk today around a quote from a Vietnamese youth worker at the community-based program that I called Riot. They said, "What's the story about us, Southeast Asians? The Vietnam War. The US rescued us, right? Nobody knows about us. That's why it's 2017 and our communities are still in survival mode. We're not running from bombs, but trying to survive the racist school system, the housing market, and the healthcare system. Racism and poverty are the Agent Orange of our generation, but nobody knows. We're just Asian." So we tell our stories in our words. Together, we build a counter-narrative, not just to showcase our resilience, but to get the story straight. They didn't rescue us, they created us. We tell our stories for visibility, for healing, and to hold the US accountable. I remember when I was talking to her, I reflected on my own experiences about what I learned about the Vietnam War in school. And I realized that I mostly learned about white people. I never learned about Southeast Asian people. But Riot was a space where everyone was Southeast Asian, and we were all the children and grandchildren of Southeast Asian refugees. Each summer, Riot brought together 24 high school youth and youth workers for 6 weeks to learn about Southeast Asian history and culture. As I observed and engaged in the space, I came to wonder, what really motivated these high-achieving young people to join Riot, a social justice-based out-of-school program? And what do they walk away with at the end? From the young people, what I learned was that even when you are academically high-achieving in a magnet school, it doesn't mean that you feel you belong. In fact, middle school, high school, and even college were experienced as temporary sites where you learn about the US. You get credentials needed for a job and to be self-sufficient, and then you're kind of on your own. This sounded very similar to the processing facilities that the previous generation of refugees moved through before eventually being resettled. So young people joined Riot to look for a place to belong. Here, they could share stories of intergenerational and poverty in their families, which they hid in school spaces. In Riot, they were able to craft a story that not only shed light on displacement that shapes our lives every day, such as the impact of deportation and gentrification, but also the agencies of refugees that are unseen. For example, our parents and grandparents, they did their best to navigate the systems that really only allowed us to survive but not thrive. Learning their stories, drawing from their resilience, and combining it with the organizing strategies that Riot taught them, young people learn to organize and challenge harmful policies and practices in education, in housing, and also immigration. Through all this, then, what we walked away with is a realization that the refugee identity does not expire. And for those of us who have been rendered invisible, the journey to healing begins with having a community where we can share our stories in our own words and strategize together to hold accountable the systems responsible for our conditions. So far, what I've told is kind of a hopeful story, but it should really be a cautionary tale, because the question that I also end up walking away with was, if we don't change how we resettle refugees and serve refugee students, will the present of Southeast Asian refugees be the future of other refugee groups in the US? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pheng. That was amazing. Now we will go into the Q&A session. Here's everyone's titles and names. I'll also post this again at the end of the presentation or at the end of the event. But yeah, I will now hand off the imaginary microphone to Matthew to help facilitate the Q&A session.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks, Michael, for that. Yeah, I just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, you can feel free to unmute your microphone. I'm going to present a first question just to kind of get us started. And then I will monitor the chat as well. But also, if you would like to chime in as well, you can feel free to use the raise your hand feature and then unmute the mic. And I'll try to follow it in order of reception of questions just to keep it objective. And then we'll move on from there. So, and now I'm not entirely aware of everyone in the room, but I understand there might be a mixed bag here, a mixed company of both undergraduates, graduates, and others. But I guess I was thinking to myself as I was processing all of this information that everyone was presenting, you know, we have a variety of different studies, quantitative studies, qualitative studies, methods were raised, concerns about philosophy, pedagogy, teaching. There's a lot of diversity and there's some overlap too. Rather than an attempt to like coalesce all that into like one thread or one theme that showed up, I thought it might be interesting to start by sort of centering our undergraduates among us. And I would imagine myself as an undergraduate sitting in this space and being like, what on earth is all this about, right? And how is this relevant to me? Maybe you're an ed studies major, but I'm wondering if our speakers maybe could speak to the undergraduates in the room first. A two-part question. One, what would you say has been the most rewarding part of your research, in spite of the challenges that many of you noted? And maybe a second dimension of that would be, how has your undergraduate self showed up in your work? In other words, like if you could remember your undergraduate self, I know it's been that long ago. How might you have recognized your undergraduate self still present in your work? And if I need to repeat anything, just let me know.
Do you want folks to go in alphabetical order?
That's a great question. What we can totally do that. Or if you feel comfortable just, you know, speaking in, that's fine. However you'd like to engage.
I can start.
Great.
As the BA person. And actually, I think probably more than most, my undergraduate experience was very long ago. So I have to really reflect on that one. So I think the most rewarding part of the research, I'll start there, is I think other speakers also noted that they had personal connections. So for me, I was really trying to understand, really is, so I kind of focused on school leadership and school finance. Really, is it ever thought about in the school level? And I was a principal and was handed a big budget and had absolutely no clue what to do with it. And really kind of struggled with thinking about, how do I make good and equitable choices for my students? And so for me, kind of getting out there and being able to ask questions about it, understand some of all the challenges, and learning from others, learning from my participants, was a really rewarding part of that experience. And actually, I think that you have all this data that comes in and you start to see these themes emerge and you get really excited about, oh, this is actually meaning something. There's something there. So that is exciting. For my undergraduate self, I, as I said, a long time ago, but I had the chance to do a senior thesis. And it was at that point that I worked with professors in a research area as opposed to just the classes in academia. And it's this amazing opportunity when you get to be curious and ask a question. And so I think as an undergrad, be curious, ask all the questions, see if you can relate to your professors on a different level than just that class interaction, can be a really powerful thing. So.
Thank you. That's great.
I can go next following alphabetical order. Matthew, I think this is a great question. I think, like Lena, the most rewarding part for me has been answering research questions that really are rooted in my experience as a first grade teacher. So I was working in a school that followed a no excuses disciplinary model that was quite strict. And through research at UW-Madison, I learned about alternatives to zero tolerance to strict discipline policies at my school that were becoming increasingly popular. And so, yeah, I think for me, the most rewarding part has been answering questions raised by my experience as a teacher. And then in terms of my undergrad self, I was an anthropology major in undergrad, and actually at the time didn't envision myself in education. And so I see a connection there in terms of, like, I've always been interested in understanding social processes through the lens of people living their lives on the ground. And so, yeah, I can definitely see a through line there in how I've used tools from anthropology and sociology in my dissertation research.
So for me, did I cut someone off?
No.
Sorry, I heard. So for me, I think one of the most rewarding things, or the part I enjoyed the most, was spending time in a different place. So I'm from Chicago, but my research focuses a lot on rural areas. And I just find it really interesting and really rewarding, like just enjoyable to just kind of hang out at like the local bar out there, or to like I went on like a Christmas hayride. And it's just like, there are parts of research that are really hard, but there are parts of research that are also like just super pleasant. And at least in my experience, and it's nice to have those interludes. As far as my undergrad self, so my undergrad self was an astrophysics major. And so I absolutely did not see myself being in education, much less being a qualitative researcher. I remember sitting in my first qual methods class going, this is garbage, nonsense. But what happened was I had the opportunity to do research in the School of Education, and I had the opportunity to do research in like really fantastic locations for astronomy. And I was able to do that research to see what it was like to be in that field and to think really carefully about what I actually valued and what I actually wanted to spend my time doing. And I realized that I like astronomy and I was interested in it, but I didn't want to spend my life advancing the frontiers. Like it just wasn't going, I would be miserable and I would be wasting a space in grad school that a more qualified person could have taken. So, and I also at the same time realized I liked the interdisciplinary research of aspects of education research. I liked talking to people more than I liked sitting at a telescope. So yeah, here I am. So I guess my advice then boils down to your major feels very important, and it is very important, and you're not married to it. Take this opportunity to like learn things that are interesting to you, regardless of if they'll get you a job or not, but also just to think through like what you want to do.
Thanks. That's great.
Yeah, great advice, Caitlin. So I guess for me, the most rewarding part of my research was the surprises that I found in the archives. And it might be common to a lot of research, but certainly in archival research, you don't know what's in those boxes. You don't know what's in the files until you actually open them up. And there were some occasions where I would be doing research and thought, oh, this is just going to be a small part of this chapter, that turned out to turn in, it eventually became a whole chapter in itself. And that happened in several occasions. I think it really helped me realize that, when you go into doing any kind of research project, whatever extent or however big it is, always be prepared to, be receptive to the information you get, the data that you get. And you might have to reevaluate and change your mind. And you may have, your initial research question might turn out to be, not the one you really want to keep going with. And that's okay. That's actually sometimes a good thing. And so it turned out that I think the dissertation was a lot better than it would have been had I stuck to my original plan. So that worked out. And as far as my undergraduate self, so I kind of have Lena's problem in that my undergraduate was so long ago. I'm like, do I remember that? I don't know. But I know I was a history major. I know that much. So maybe, well, I know why, because the reason I majored in history was I've always liked to understand how things are the way they are. How did they become the way they are? What's the story? The classic, saying is, everything has a history. And so in that respect, I suppose my old, much younger undergraduate self lingered long enough so that when I finally went back for the PhD, it took over. But certainly I'd echo Dr. Brecklin's recommendation that don't worry too much about your major. Whatever you're passionate about now, go with that. It'll turn out fine.
I like that. It's all gonna be fine. Yeah, so in terms of impactful or most meaningful, I think being able to pursue topics that are salient to like current policy issues. I mean, there's teacher shortages, there's teacher attrition, there's teacher turnover, and a lot of that comes down to working conditions. And so being able to be involved and examine how those working conditions are born and how we might be able to intervene in those has been pretty cool. I've got a working conditions framework I'm developing. So if you're a total masochist and want to give me feedback on that, please reach out, because I've just been thinking a lot about this and it's been really generative. And as I mentioned, rewarding, because some of these things don't get seen. And when you're talking to a participant and they're like, no one's ever asked this before, it's just like, well, we should. And I don't know, that feels pretty cool. In terms of my undergrad self, I was really directionless and did not take my education seriously as an undergrad. Like the Windows screensavers that kind of like bounce off the different corners. I feel like that's like more akin to my educational trajectory. During that time, I ended up as a communications and media theory person, which is still cool. And I liked it. And it definitely informs my work now. But I think during that time period, I really sought out community. And community was really what bolstered me to learn about different avenues. It's what kind of drove me to, learn new things, explore different places. And I continue to reference that even now, and certainly throughout graduate school, where it was like the people around me that were either providing emotional support or just different perspectives and different avenues to learn things were really crucial for me. And so I think that's how I see that version of Rosie showing up in present day.
Very cool.
So it's really hard for me to answer this question because I kind of feel like the rewards and the challenges are very intertwined for me. And I think if I were to look back on myself, I think that so there are many reasons why one goes and gets a degree, right? So we would you're trying to get a job, you're trying to learn more. And I think I was trying to do all of those. But what I was also trying to do was escape certain parts of my community, sexism, racism, homophobia, poverty. So then these are all kind of intertwined together. And so what I would tell my undergrad self is that it's okay that you cannot articulate everything that you're interested in and feeling, because you are not going to probably be able to do that even well into your 30s, where I am now. And I see that what happens though was it was my graduate education that would take me back to all the things that I tried to escape. So ultimately, I wasn't able to escape any of the things that I did not wish to confront. So for the undergrads in the room, I would say that we often don't think about how our research may impact us. We rightfully should consider how we impact our participants in the spaces that we research. But if there's any sort of healing work that you need to do, whether it is going to therapy, learning different strategies, having a community, or making friends, you need to do that now. Because being a healthy and whole person will really help you to carry you through all the different stages of your research and your academic career. And I don't want to share too much more about myself, so that's all.
Great. Thank you so much. And everyone, thank you so much. I think the way you responded to those questions was really helpful. I mean, I heard a lot of wisdom and joy and optimism and realism all blended together. And that's a really beautiful thing. And I think, academic research can be so dehumanizing sometimes. And I think it's nice to just sort of remember, like, there are people behind our studies, and people, not just the people that we're studying or talking about, whether it be history or qualitative or whatever researches we're doing, but we ourselves as scholars are that. And I think for any undergraduates in the room who would be thinking about aspiring to do more advanced degrees, these kinds of, I think, conversations are helpful. And I guess I'll just turn it over to the rest of the participants or the audience members, whether you're graduate students like me, which of course I think you might have very particular kinds of questions that you would want to ask particular presenters. But I just want to open the room to you all and who would have a question. So again, I'll be monitoring the chat and or the hand raise feature, or just chime in if you feel comfortable.
I have a question. Am I allowed to have questions?
I think you're allowed to have questions.
Great. So Keith, this is particularly for you. So how do you see, especially because you're working, in this different office, how do you see your work in history, like, as informing or related to your current work? Or is it something you're maybe not referencing? Is it like, was this a pivot for you? Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think it's helpful in terms of providing a perspective that I don't think a lot of my colleagues in the department have. I know a lot about the battles over federal, federal influence in education. I know the history of this legislation that we're tasked to implement. So I have a little bit of understanding of the nuances in a broader sense than I think some of the people I work with who deal with, like the data collection every day, don't quite have. That has been helpful, I think, especially when I'm having conversations about certain decisions that we want to make in the department that I think might need a little more historical context, but unfortunately, you know, I'm not one of the you know, the top policymakers, so they don't ask me questions that I might actually have an opinion on. But I think generally, yeah, just that broad understanding in that context has just been helpful in a variety of ways. But in terms of my day-to-day work, I don't do a lot of archival work, so it's not a really direct relevance so much, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
I can have a question too. I'm curious, for those of you who did ethnographic research, what the process of sharing your findings has been with participants. I'm currently so I actually just defended at the end of August, and I'm kind of in that, you know, drafting an executive summary to share and thinking through productive ways to do that. So I'm just curious to hear from you all what your experience was like.
I can go. So I was in the field for about 2 years officially, and then I remained in contact with them until now. So for me, the process of sharing with my participants actually began while I was in the field, in which I would process insights or findings with them. And after the field, what I did was I had also helped to kind of craft the the curriculum materials of the Riot program based on what I had learned in the previous years. So really, I was very involved, and that might be a different experience from people who are not as involved. And I'm continuing to offer the insights I've learned from my time in the program as a board member on the organization too. I'd say that for those of us who do ethnographic work, especially those who could do community-based work, sometimes we think that it is a balance between your role as a researcher and as a community member. For myself, I often think of myself as being a community member first and then a researcher second. But I do, you know, continue to kind of reflect also on what that actually means in practice. So that's as far as I've gotten, Abby.
Well, if no one else, we have a question in the chat, in the Q&A chat, from Kyungjin, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, so please forgive me. But she says, "Thank you for the great presentations. I have a question to you all. What were the most unexpected challenges you faced during your dissertation project? What advice would you offer to graduate students preparing for their dissertation projects?" That's a great question.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time, please?
Of course, yeah. She says, "Thank you for the great presentations. I have a question to you all. What were the most unexpected challenges you faced during your dissertation project? And what advice would you offer to graduate students preparing for their dissertation projects?"
I think Rosie already alluded to this, and we may be in a group that's in a very special situation. I was starting my data collection. I had a grand plan of tons of observations, tons of interviews. I had a good crop of participants ready to go. I was 2 weeks in and the world shut down due to COVID. And so all of my plans were gone. So at that point, I learned to expect the unexpected, and that I had to be flexible at every point of the situation. I like the things that I had planned for were ending or interviewing principals was always going to be like anywhere in like district administration, working in schools. You're never the first priority, nor should you be. You are always going to be second to what's going on in the schools, to the students. And so I thought that was going to be more my challenge of honoring their time and finding a space for my research to happen. But I learned, be very, very flexible. Do not get beholden to your plan. And even if everything goes as you expect it to, part of my question was around a policy. No one had ever heard of the policy. And so I thought it was maybe having this impact on teachers and principals, and they didn't even know about it. They're like, oh, tell me more. All of my school financial information is being out there and it's being published. Had no clue. So expect unexpected things in terms of what you hear from your participants that may take you in a different place and route, and that what you plan may not happen at all, and it will still happen. As Rosie said, it will still happen and you'll still get it done, just maybe in a different form.
This is very like nuts and bolts kind of advice, but over document things, like take notes when you don't think you have to. For me, I observed a bunch of public hearings, and they straight up said, we're recording this. Recordings and transcripts will be made available. So I thought to myself, okay, I don't have to write down what people are saying. I can like observe the crowd, observe body language, observe the panel, right? So I'm taking all these really beautiful detailed notes about things that are not, and I'm just kind of summarizing what people are saying rather than trying to capture direct quotes. And I have still not seen recordings or transcripts of those meetings. Apparently the transcriptionist died soon after, so they like didn't get the and they hadn't received the transcripts yet, and so they were like working on finding someone to redo them. And like about every 6 months I email someone at DPI like, hey, did you ever hear about those? And about 3 months after that, he'll email back, we'll have them soon. So yeah, don't count on anyone for data that they will say for information even when they are required to give it to you by law, don't count on it.
Don't trust anyone is what I'm getting from that.
Basically, yes.
Yeah. I think, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to make a slight joke and say I trusted Caitlin because we had a meeting when I was a first year student, and she said, get Zotero.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, what's Zotero? And she said, it'll save your life. And I said, okay. And then like a year in, I was like, I think I need a Zotero thing. Zotero has saved my life. So thank you, Caitlin.
I have something. So you will not know or realize how tired you will be at each step of the dissertation process. And you will only get more tired as you go through it, because you didn't rest when you needed to, and then it kind of compounds. And that's why it gets very hard, that last push to write the dissertation also. So I graduated in May, so that's still very fresh in my mind, that that was type of intense 6 months. What you need to have now are kind of your ride or die people in which you will help one another to get to the finish line. And that is having like 2-week accountability writing, if that's what you need. It will look different for everyone, but I can tell you that if I had not joined Erica Turner's writing group, I would not have been able to finish my dissertation. So we stress this over and over again. You need friends, you need community to help carry you to the finish line. It would be very hard to do it alone. Some people are amazing, they can do it alone. Most of us are not. And so, you look for them now to make sure that you learn actually what your writing process is like. Because if you're trying to figure out what your writing process is like when you need to graduate in 6 months, it's a little bit late. I'm not saying you won't finish, because you will, because you have to. But you will make your life easier once you know all your own quirks in advance.
I'll add one more thing to the really insightful things that everyone else has shared so far. It just is so overwhelming, right? I mean, you're just like, I have to create, this 200-page document or 150-page document, whatever it is. And I think remembering that you've already written so much by the time you get to your dissertation, like it's okay to use those things. I mean, you might have to go back and I don't think this is answering the question, but here we are, and edit and reframe. And that is its own frustration because you're like, oh man, I had this great idea coming in and now it is totally shifted. But it does not have to be all original material in that way. I think even like for like thinking about grant applications, like there's an episode of The Simpsons where Marge gets a Chanel suit and she's trying to get in with the country club people. And so she keeps on taking the same suit and like making different outfits with it. And just like, and that's how I really thought about my dissertation was it was just like this different iteration of these things I'd already written. So the challenge was that it was overwhelming. It was also really annoying to be like, man, this has changed again. But the flip side of that is I had a lot of source material to draw from that I could appropriate for my dissertation.
That's good advice.
I can add another challenge unless we want to move to a new question.
Go ahead, Abby. Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I would say maybe I'll just go with advice and the challenge is baked in here, but I would say start access. Like access is difficult. So depending on the topic that you're studying, I was studying school discipline, which is politically charged. So I would say my advice would be to start trying to gain access as soon as you can and developing those relationships. And then I think for me, a challenge was like I was used to taking field notes in the context of school district meetings, and taking school-based field notes was much different. There's so many things going on in a classroom. And I think my advice would be my nugget of advice is not to go back in the field until you have finished your prior field notes.
Yeah. My only addition to this is simply be prepared to lose interest in your topic at some point. The honeymoon may not last, and that's okay. It happens. It happened to me anyway, and I suspect it happens with others. That doesn't mean you picked the wrong topic. That doesn't mean you wasted a lot of time doing the initial research and your proposal wasn't good. Certainly if you've made it past the proposal stage, your advisors or whoever gave it the green light probably thinks that yes, this is fine. Be prepared to have to sort of work through that, which the caveat to that is your enthusiasm will also not always be on high speed, and that's fine. That happens as well. But if you've done due diligence in picking something that has been bugging you long enough, you're probably on the right path, even if the details aren't entirely filled out yet. Have some faith in some of that initial, sort of your gut instinct and all of the feedback you get. So that's just my general across the board advice or observation.
That's great. Thanks, Keith. Emily, did you have a hand raise?
Emily, do you have a question?
I do have a question, but Lena, if you want to say something, go ahead. Oh, okay. Well, thank you all. These were really beautiful presentations. I feel like you presented a lot of information in a very succinct and clear way, which was excellent. I am at the point where I am doing analysis and beginning the writing stage. And so where I'm at, I'm like, I don't have a lot of direction as to where I'm going. And then to see you all's final projects being very neat and clear is pretty amazing. So any advice on how to get from, oh my gosh, I have all this data, what do I do, to where you are now?
Emily, that actually goes exactly to what I was going to say. We had it off, so I will go with that. Rachel Feldman graduated a couple of years before us, and I remember I would chat with her, and I ran into her at one point, and I was asking her how all of her analysis and her work was going, and she's like, I spend a lot of time thinking. I just think and that always stuck with me, especially having come from being a teacher and in administration. Like you go every single second. And so it's this different world all of a sudden being when you're writing the dissertation that you need time to reflect. You need time to kind of marinate in everything that you're getting, because it is a lot. It's a lot coming toward you. And I think maybe we all have our own way of like processing thoughts. For me, and I know we've mentioned Erica Turner. Erica Turner also definitely kept us going. And she would make me memo anything that I would ask about, talk about. She's like, memo, get your thoughts on paper, spend time. And that was like my thinking. I would write it out. If I had an idea, I would memo about it. And so spending that time really thinking in my own way, part of it was the writing, or maybe like talking it out with some of the people here on the presentation. We spent a lot of time talking about our ideas. And also, I have a dog, and I had to walk that dog all the time. And so sometimes it was an hour or two, and I would just go out to the dog park with my dog, and I would just think for those 2 hours about what I was hearing. So give yourself that space and make that space and memo, or however you process your ideas, and find ways to kind of get it to a point where it's helpful for you. So it's that reflection time that you don't always plan for, but you really need.
Great advice.
I think for a while I was just like outside of double dutch, maybe this is the right moment, maybe this is the right piece of data. And it's just like, you just can't. You just gotta stick your hand out, see what you grab, and start there. Like there's no perfect place to start. And I think getting past that first, I don't know, break into things goes a long way. What I had to do this is from a different project, but for a while I had to do my like transcriptions for different things. And so when I would finish a transcription, I would then transcribe the first minute of the next piece, just so the seal was broken. So that way, when I was coming back to it, it didn't feel like I was starting fresh. And the same thing for analysis, where it's just like, okay, I've coded, the first, I don't know, even just the first segment of this. So it doesn't feel like, at least for me, that felt like this Herculean effort to like open a thing and start it new, as opposed to just, it felt more like a continuation of work, and it felt like it helped me have momentum, is a strategy.
For me, I found it very helpful to just use as many different approaches as felt right. Like I'm someone who I always want to like wait until it feels good to work, but you can't. But so like for coding, I coded in Word and I coded in Deduce, and I printed out all of my interviews and coded them by hand. And at my defense, Nancy was like, well, what did that get you? And I was like, well, honestly, it was just so something felt new and shiny, and it was a different way of engaging. And so, yeah, it's kind of just very similar to what Rosie said, just grab something and go. There's no perfect dissertation. A good dissertation is a done dissertation.
I think it also depends on what type of dissertation you're going to write, because some people will write 3 articles, and then some people will write one where there's an overarching story. And for mine, it was the second one. And so what I did was, like everyone was talking about, memos are writing is thinking. And I remember right after I got off the field, I was kind of broken inside. So I needed to rest, but also I think Leslie told me, memo about why you're broken. And then that's what I did. And so what came about it was that what I was feeling was being overwhelmed by all the stories that I had witnessed in the field and all of their feelings also. And then after so many memos, the story kind of revealed itself of intergenerational poverty, of trauma, of continuing displacement, actually, because I coded the memos, and those were the themes that arose from them across all of them. And so then for me, those memos, the portraits that I wrote ended up actually going into my first chapter. in which I also continue to craft stories about school spaces too. And you don't only have to memo, you can be memo very much close to the data and literature, but some of us will also write reflexive memos. I have lots of feelings. And so naturally, I had to kind of draw out, why did I feel certain ways about different spaces or different people or different policies? And so that's actually where I started. And so, you really need to think about or try, as Caitlin did, like try very different types of memos to really dig at what is that thing that is really unforgettable for you when you leave the space. Because usually that turns out to be the story that you can then unpack.
Thank you for that. Any other questions for the group? Well, if there were no others, again, thank you everyone for your presence here and for your presence of your presence, if you know what I mean. That's terrible, bad puns, but I'm apologizing, but I'm kind of unapologetic about it, so it is what it is. Again, if you have any questions for any of our speakers, feel free to reach out to them. And thanks so much, everyone. Hope you all have a good weekend and take good care.